I'm TerryDavidMulligan. This is the Mulligan Stew Podcast. This week, part one of our conversation with Little Steven, Miami's Steve Van Zandt, and his new autobiography, Unrequited Infatuations. When you think about Little Steven, what's most in front of us, what we most recognize about him is his 20 years with Bruce Springsteen as his sidekick in the E Street Band, his starring role in Sopranos, his starring role and his writing in Lilyhammer, and even the Artists Against Apartheid single, Sun City, that eventually got Nelson Mandela released from jail. Those are just some of the highlights. You can't imagine how much more of the story we don't know about or may have forgotten about. And that's what this book is all about. It's fantastic. About a kid from Jersey who grows up to be one of the great rock and rollers in the business and becomes one of the most famous people ever to come from New Jersey, along with always Bruce Springsteen. But also, he got to change the world, and still to this day is changing the world. He's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He now chooses, as part of a committee, who gets into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He is perhaps the world's foremost authority on what is the true rock and roll. Not some BS rock and roll, the actual core rock and roll. Talk to Little Steven. That's actually where we start this interview. So this is part one. Part two is for next week. Do enjoy. And we welcome back Miami Steve Van Zandt. First of all, welcome to Mulligan Stew. The interesting thing is that you and I have traveled many of the same roads, completely different. We cross the same paths. We love the same bands. I would thank you right now, right this second, for getting Bert Burns into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Well, that was my pleasure, believe me.
Cry to me.
My honor.
Cry to me. On one song alone, the man should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
He was lucky because, it's not a household name. It's not easy to get in.
He was an intriguing individual. I mean, let's face it. I've loved this book. I want my sleep back because I'm reading at 2 o'clock in the morning because I can concentrate at 2 o'clock in the morning. But it's fantastic. Just when I think that you've maybe wrapped up one chapter in your life, I turn the next page, and no. There's a coda. There's a by the way, the asides are as good as the damn writing itself. It's how did you find time, and how did you remember? Because I went through the same process with my book. How did you remember these moments? Did you keep a diary? Were the photographs, or did friends around you fill in the story?
No, I wish I had kept a diary. Let me tell you something. I remember about 10% of it. So, the book could have been 3 times longer. The one helpful thing came in the 90s, which was a lost decade in my mind. And I went to my office and I said, go back and get out the old biographies and the old schedules and see if you can assemble what I was doing in the 90s. It turns out I was doing a lot of things in the 90s, but I didn't really remember them because that was the first time in my life I had no plan. I had no mission. I come back from my solo, so-called career, and walked away from that. After having walked away from the E Street, now I walked away from my own career, and I once again had no plan. And so in my mind, that was really the first time I had absolutely no mission whatsoever. And turns out I did a lot of things, so that was helpful. It was helpful to actually see what was in my old biographies, what I was doing. But
Sure.
Mostly not. Mostly I just kind of transported myself back and tried to relive it, because I never look back, I never do. So it was actually fun, especially the 60s stuff was really fun to go back to the teenage years. That was the best time.
No, you could tell. No, you could. It shows. Even if you don't write it, it's in between the lines. And I totally agree with you that the music that transports you still to this day comes from the 50s and 60s. Absolutely. Yeah. And I have a fascination. You know that record, The Fat Man, Fats Domino?
Yeah,
okay.
Like 48, 49.
Okay, so 49. And it's rock and roll, right? I mean, it's freaking rock and roll. It's 1949. It's 6 years before anybody starts to do the term rock and roll. It was already shaped and formed. It just needed a voice.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. No. The 40s are very underrated as a wild time, man. There was lots of shit going on in the 40s.
Jump blues, right? Jump blues.
Yeah. Louis Jordan and all the rest, and that's a direct link. It's a direct link to the early, the cat who really invented it for me was Little Richard.
Yeah.
He's the archetype of what rock and roll would be, but yeah, there's a 40s antecedent. You can see where it's coming from. These things don't drop out of the air. Everything comes from somewhere, and starting in the 40s already, they were starting to kind of cut down on the big bands. They were slowly going to be cut down to the point where, they just couldn't afford the big bands anymore. And then, you end up with what Little Richard and Fats, were doing, which was like, they might have 3 or 4 horns, maybe 5, but that's about it.
Right. We're talking to Miami Steve Van Zandt. I'm TerryDavidMulligan. This is the Mulligan Stew podcast. And his book that's just been released called Unrequited Infatuations. It's large, many stories. I have a hunch it's probably part 1 of 2 or 3 parts. And speaking of parts, this is part 1 of our conversation with Miami Steve. Next week, part 2. You also took me back to that time when and I hang on to, I still do specials on it. When the lead instrument, when the singer was done with the microphone, was not a guitar wailing, it was a saxophone. It was all those sax guys.
Oh yeah, no, the British invasion put I don't know how many 30, 35 fantastic sax players out of work. I mean, they were on every single record.
King Curtis,
every single record.
Lee Allen.
Yeah. Oh no, I think I did a little bit of a list in the book, but it was literally 25, 30, 35, and they're all fantastic. Yeah.
And let me just keep going. I'm scattergunning here. Let me that you could find mentors in all of this was gold. It was just gold. Jerry Lieber, Mike Stoller. Is it possible to talk about their impact even today on music?
Well, they to me, they were the beginning of the formal sort of institutionalizing of what we call rock and roll. I mean, they were the first real songwriter producers, and they just had not only an enormous talent, but they had a sense of humor when they needed it, and a lot of the 50s stuff was kind of novelty related in those days. I mean, there was a novelty aspect to a lot of the 50s stuff, and it probably would have stayed that way if it wasn't for the 60s. But they just they didn't really. I mean, they were coming from being basically blues guys, and then started to expand it. Once they added strings to the Drifters.
Yeah,
There Goes My Baby.
Yep.
Really started to open the thing up a little bit, and just their little movies with the coasters. Their little fun little. It might have been comedy, but they were very, very creative, and then several versions of the Drifters, of course, and the stuff they did with Elvis Presley was his best stuff.
Youngblood, the Coasters, still turns my crank.
Yeah, and Searching, and so many, Charlie Brown, Yakety Yak,
that stuff.
Yeah, just really fun.
So, in bookkeeping terms, in book writing terms, who was your Lieber Stoller? Who wrote the rock and roll book?
I tell you the truth, I really, really, really prefer biography to autobiography. I love the third person thing. That's why, I did the prologue and epilogue that way. And that's all they would let me do. The rest, they insisted I do in first person. But, my favorite two biographies are Nick Kosh's, the Dean Martin book and the Jerry Lee Lewis book. They're to me the two most incredible biographies ever written. But autobiographies, Bob Dylan's is one of my favorites. I thought Bruce's was terrific. Keith Richards was good. But when it came down to it, I was really doing something completely different. So I couldn't really compare it to anything. I wanted to, and I had a terrific editor, this Ben Greenman. And I said to him, listen, man, your main job is to make sure I maintain a balance.
Yes.
Of three things.
Yeah.
I want, yes, we're going to have the narrative, but I want the history stuff, to be right alongside it, because I witnessed the whole history of rock and roll except for the first decade, and the craft stuff. I got a lot of observations about various crafts that I think can be useful. So I want to hopefully make this book useful, and not just another music book from music people. There's plenty of that stuff in there too. But so he did a terrific job making sure I stayed on that path and kept those three things in balance. And that's unlike, really, there's nothing you can really compare that to, because everybody else's book is a little bit a different story, but I wanted mine to be those three things.
But only you can be in your shoes. For example, let me segue. You walked into, I think, the 10th Avenue Freeze Out sessions.
Right.
And I believe Bruce said to you, "What do you think?" See, only you can answer that question. Yeah, it was a big mistake asking me that. But I mean, you always had an answer.
Well, yeah, because I always have an opinion. I do, I do. I'm an opinionated son of a bitch, and and I know, I don't force it on people. I know when to, keep my mouth shut. And I wouldn't have said anything if they hadn't asked me, but they made the mistake of asking, so
And wait a minute,
you're going to get the truth.
On page 80, you walk into the Born to Run session, and I believe the term you used referred to suckage. Was that correct?
Well, suckage. Well, no. The 10th Avenue was different. That was two different things.
That's right. That's right.
The 10th Avenue thing was in a newer studio, the record plant, and at that time, it was just the worst time in the world to record. All records sound great in the 50s and 60s, and they all sounded good from the 80s on. 70s, man, it just was the worst time to record. And things that did not sound great. There's a couple exceptions to the rule, of course, like Led Zeppelin, for instance, who was wise enough to use room sound when everybody else was padding everything and putting pillows and drums and rugs on the walls and, basically making everything sound like you're claustrophobic. So that was sucking. That session with 10th Avenue, when they asked me how, I was just like, this whole thing sucks. I mean, it sounds terrible. They're playing terrible. The charts are terrible. Everything sucks about this. But Born to Run was a different story, because it was the older studio, which sounded better actually. The old 914 studio, Jules, I forget his name now, but a famous engineer. It was his studio. And that was a different case. That was a case where, I thought I was giving him a compliment on the Born to Run riff, and turns out that I was hearing something completely different than he thought he had recorded. And that was a whole different scenario. But I just happened along at a good moment, because they thought they were done. And you got to wonder what would have happened if that record had come out the way they thought.
I love the read on page 93, the one that says, the pioneers of the 50s invented rock. The Renaissance arts of the 60s elevated to an art form. Bruce was determined to create work that would not only distract, entertain, and transport, but also educate, simulate, and inspire. He wanted to provide irrefutable proof that life had meaning. And then you ended off with a beautiful line, hope, not hype. Love that. Love that line.
Yeah, no, that was it. I mean, Bruce was really the finest, leader of the third generation of rock and roll. He was taking it to a new place. And I wasn't all that conscious of it at the time, but looking back now, as I describe my feelings about what John Landau meant when he said Bruce Springsteen was the future of rock and roll. I gave great detail about that, and what I concluded was what he meant by that was Bruce is being third generation rock and roll. He's now including all the art forms in this new art form. From literature and cinema, and you name it, and that was a new idea. As well, heavy reliance on substance, which would come across mainly in live concerts. When he would do some raps in between the songs, especially in the darkness on the edge of town years.
Yep.
It was the tour would be an extension of the artistic process. The record didn't just end with the record. It continued with what was going on live, and I have continued to do that same thing with my own work and my own tours and my own records. All of my stuff was completely substance. It was nothing else but, and I would continue that right into the shows myself. So that was but all that was new. That was a new idea. Using all the different art forms and integrating them into the music, and then continuing to have a substantive discussion with an audience. Live. I mean, who did that?
Yeah.
Nobody.
Nobody. Nobody.
Yeah.
We're talking to Miami Steve Van Zandt. I'm TerryDavidMulligan. This is the Mulligan Stew podcast. And his book that's just been released called Unrequited Infatuations. It's large, many stories. I have a hunch it's probably part one of 2 or 3 parts. And speaking of parts, this is part 1 of our conversation with Miami Steve. Next week, part 2. I love the word that you used in and around John Landau, talking about the learning the complexities of recording and the music and the business. That's what you knew. You knew where all the skeletons, all the bones were hidden. You did. You knew where the trap falls were. You knew where the gold was, and you knew where the slugs were.
Yeah, musically, yeah. I was, I had gone to my own version of school between producing the first 3 Jukes albums.
Yep.
And the year I spent on the oldie circuit at the Stone Pony, when I was in the Jukes. But all that stuff added up to something that was really useful that I put to use on the river. It all came together for the river, and we were able to finally capture the live sound of the band on a record. Because as I described, the 5 crafts of rock and roll, which I go into in great detail.
Yes.
The fifth craft is learning how to record. It's not something you're born knowing how to do.
Actually, what you're talking about is learning how not to record.
Well, that's right.
That's it right there.
That's right. I mean, right. And I was just I was so kind of naive enough to think, when I walk into a room and a band's playing, that's a certain sound. Well, I want to hear that same sound on a record when I walk into the control room, you know, and that was not the case in the 70s, because, you know, they were like, let's take all the excitement out of recording and then we'll put it all back in the mix. You know, I was like, this is retarded. This is fucking stupid. You know, and you know, I mean, I want to hear the end result right now.
I can remember. You know, I can remember a quote from Dion. I know he's a friend of yours, but many years ago, saying, "We never got it as good as the stairwell where they practiced, where they worked out their harmonies. Right, a stairwell when 5 or 6 in their apartment building, they never got it as good as what they heard in the stairwell."
Exactly, which, by the way, is how Led Zeppelin's, you know, John Bonham's drums sounded better than everybody else's in the 70s, because they recorded it in a stairwell.
Yep. And
just to make that connect the dots there.
and little Mountain Studios in Vancouver, where Slippery When Wet went down, and Metallica went down, all sorts of stuff, Aerosmith. But they recorded those drums in the loading dock, all the concrete in the loading dock, and you just have to know how to do that.
There you go. That's it. Concrete, bricks, wood. That's what rock and roll is all about.
So on page 154 of this incredible book, Unrequited Infatuations, from Stevie Van Zandt, you get to 154, you quit. You walk away. First of all, you mentioned ADD. When did you realize that you had difficulty and were dealing with ADD?
Well, it's not official. You know, it's not like a complete. I never had it. Had diagnosis. You know, but I just can't slow down to the pace of the world.
Yeah.
You know,
of your world.
As that. I mean,
yeah.
You know, the world just moves too slow for me, man. You know, I mean, that's why I can't wait around for the lawyers. I can't wait around for contracts. You know, I'm like, come on, man, let's get on with it. You know. But
you did. You dealt with it, and the read about Mandela and South Africa is absolutely fantastic. And then it leads to Sopranos. It leads to Lilyhammer. The 2 radio formats that I love both. As a matter of fact, the cleaning, the lady upstairs who's doing the cleaning has got Outlaw on, and she's cleaning to Merle Haggard. That's it. You got a record label, music history curriculum, that was great for you. Patty got to join the E Street Band and do your vocals. Everybody else carried the guitar parts, and you got on with your life. It is an incredible read. It's the core of the book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think what's most interesting to me, looking back, you know, you get the first half of the book, you know, which is a local kid from Jersey makes it to the top in rock and roll, which is a terrific story, you know, and one I do not take for granted, you know. But but when I leave the E Street Band, you know, in the second half of the book, that's when I think things get a little bit more interesting in a more universal way. You know, now it starts to leave the realm of, you know, a music book for music people, and start to take on bigger themes, you know, like the search for identity, the search for purpose that everybody has, you know, that search for spiritual enlightenment. And I think, you know, that those more universal themes start to really resonate when you realize that I thought my life was over when I left the E Street Band. I mean, I honestly thought it was over, you know, and yet everything I've accomplished since. You know, and I think that's an interesting thing for people to kind of look at in their own lives, because they're eventually, you might, you know, a lot of people are going to hit the wall. They're gonna be disappointed with life, and maybe the plan doesn't work out. But if they can find a way to keep going, to keep moving forward, and don't succumb to dope or alcohol or suicide.
Yep.
Or, you know, all of which I considered. You know, if you can find a way to move forward, then destiny has a way of saying, "Hey, man, we're not done with you yet." You know, there's going to be some surprises.
Yep.
And you will find that, life is not as over as you thought. So I'm hoping that my story can be useful that way, you know.
We're talking to Miami Steve Van Zandt. I'm TerryDavidMulligan. This is the Mulligan Stew Podcast. And his book that's just been released called Unrequited Infatuations. It's large, many stories. I have a hunch it's probably part one of 2 or 3 parts. That's part one of our conversation with Steve Van Zandt, Little Steven, and his group, the Disciples of Soul. He will be back next week, and we'll do part 2 of his life and times and still not get it all in. But this is the complete interview. I hope you enjoy it. It's fair to say there have been very few people, rock and rollers in particular, who have ever had such an effect on their life and times as Little Steven. Steve Van Zandt, our guest on the Mulligan Stew Podcast, part 2 next week. You can find all of the details on Little Steven, including a link to his bio, which is huge, and it can be found at mulliganstew.ca. Thank you for listening.